So while they're doing that, I'm just going to introduce our company. So my name is Rafi. Work for Backbox. We're an Israeli-based company. We've been partners with Palo Alto for the past, I think, 6 years now. Also part of the Fuel community. And today we're going to talk about operational efficiency and automation. I want to talk about how we're going to take a lot of the things that you're probably either doing manually or scripted or not doing at all that you should be doing, and how we can help you automate some of those processes and give you better visibility, better uptime, minimize downtime, and really save you a lot of time in automating some of these tasks that you're going to run. So we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to start with disaster recovery, talk about inventory management, show you a little bit around the visibility of your network and how we can help you automate and understand what you have on the network. We're going to talk about orchestrating some of those different tasks that you have to execute on multiple types of devices. This session is being recorded, so I'm not going to name any other vendor, but I'm going to say ahead of time, Lee, that everything that I'm going to talk about applies to more than 170 different vendors. So we are a Palo partner, as I mentioned, but everything that I'm going to talk about applies to all the devices that you have on your network as far as the security and network infrastructure is concerned. So it's going to be firewalls, routers, switchers, load balancers, SSL, VPNs, content filters, etc. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what we refer to as IntelliChecks, our ability to better monitor or do in-depth monitoring of your network. And then we're going to talk about, and I had a bet with Stephanie here, how many times I'm going to say the word BAM, so you'll understand at the end what that means, but this is something new that we're introducing today. So let's start. So let's talk a little bit about disaster recovery and some of the challenges that you might be facing with backup of configuration of devices. So in order to have a good disaster recovery procedure, the challenges that we found is how do we make sure that we can back up the configuration of all our security and network devices and make sure that they are intact and valid for a proper disaster recovery procedure. So when we first started Backbox about 9 years ago, everybody was scripting. So with Palo, with other vendors, you can just write a script or actually use the built-in capabilities of some of the management platforms like Panorama in order to back up the configuration of the devices for the purpose of disaster recovery. But we found that with a lot of customers, even with a scripted solution or the built-in management solution, some challenges are around how do we know if our files are intact, if they're not corrupted, and are they secure? So with Backbox, what we're doing is we're not only connecting to each and every device that you have on the network and just pulling the config files like your management platforms or your scripts, but we're actually validating the integrity of those files. We're making sure that they're not corrupted, they're in the right size range, and that they contain the right content for a proper disaster recovery procedure. We're, of course, storing all of that in one central location. We're encrypting all the files. So if at any point any of your devices fails, it would be very easy to just RMA the box, get a new box in, plug it into the network with a basic IP address, and then with a one-click option, recover that configuration. So with Backbox, we have 2 ways of recovering a device, one for online and one for offline options. So if you want to recover that device offline, you would just connect it to your laptop or your lab environment and use our built-in disaster recovery procedures. So these are step-by-step procedures where we teach you how to recover that device. The second alternative is to do a full automated recovery process where you plug it into the network, log into our interface, and with a single click, not only are we able to recover that device, but we're also able to verify that the file that you're recovering is actually the file that was backed up and it didn't change. So we'll run a SHA-256 checksum before we recover, and we compare it to that same checksum that existed on the device during that recovery process. So that means that our disaster recovery procedure is now very simple. So if you have to comply with any of the standards out there in the industry, with Backbox, you are now you can make sure that you have that recovery procedure in place, either for a manual process or for an automated process. So looking at this, if we do a full automated recovery process, we're able to verify that these are exactly the files that we're recovering. Now, one of the challenges that we saw with the built-in management capabilities of some of the vendors is that they're not always backing up all the files that you need for recovery. Things like license information and certificates are not necessarily part of that backup process. So with Backbox, we're not only utilizing the existing capabilities of whatever the vendor is offering, but we're taking everything on the system that is required for a full disaster recovery procedure. Now that we're plugged into all the devices, that means that we have access to all your routers and switches and firewalls, et cetera. The second challenge that we found is how do we keep track of all of our assets? How do we keep track of license information and serial numbers and end of life and end of support information? So since we're already logged into the systems, by the way, we are totally agentless, so that means that whenever we connect to any device, you don't have to manipulate anything on the config of that device. We will log in using the standard administrative protocols that still exist on those systems. So this could be Telnet, SSH, HTTP, HTTPS, etc. So we have the credential information, we have the connection to the devices because we're backing up the configuration. So now we wanted to take that static Excel spreadsheet that you have and eliminate that as well. So a lot of customers we found are using those spreadsheets in order to keep track of the assets. So what versions am I running? What type of hardware platform is scattered in my network? So with Backbox, while we're logging in and while we're doing the backup of the configuration, we're also collecting the asset information. So this can be major and minor version, hardware platform, license, certificates, anything that exists in order to make sure that you're keeping track of your assets. Why is this important? So let's say that you want to upgrade your devices to the latest Pan OS, 9.1, I believe, right now. You want to make sure that you are able to go from whatever version you have right now to that latest version. So with this information, you're able to basically run a gap analysis and understand how many hops am I going to have to take while I want to upgrade from version 7.1, let's say, to all the way to the latest version. So we're running this information, we're executing this usually daily, so this information is very dynamic. You can also execute it ad hoc whenever you want to see that information, and we can export it and give you that visibility on what are those assets on the network, and am I in trouble as far as upgrades, end of life, end of support, etc. So we're collecting the config information, we're collecting the asset information. The next thing that we wanted to collect is the layer 3 information. So again, another application that you might be using, something like Visio, in order to map your network, understand all the different locations, and layer 3 information, routing, IP information, etc. So while we're logging on to those same devices and collecting the asset information, we're also collecting everything around the layer 3 configuration. So IP addresses, VLANs, routing, both static and dynamic, in order to help you see your network dynamically. So rather than updating either a diagram, a Visio diagram, or any other tool that you use, we're able to collect that information and give you visualization of your network. So outside of this being nice, so you can see everything, the added value that we bring with the network visibility is to understand how my network is routed. So let's say that somebody asks you to open a rule within a firewall, so access from one endpoint to a service. How do you know which layer 3 devices am I going through? How do we know where do we have to open the access rules? So not only are we giving you that information and showing you the map, but you can also path that source and destination within our network diagram. So you can specify a source IP address, a destination IP address, and we will highlight the path in your network that traffic has to go through. So now you know which maybe access list you have to create on your switches, where do you have to open the different rules in your firewalls, and gain that information very quickly and very dynamically. Quick show of hands, version 7. Who's running version 7? Only a couple. Version 8? Probably most. Anybody upgrade to 9 yet? Okay. So now I want to talk about a little bit about orchestration. So orchestration is our ability to take a configuration, whatever it is. This could be two lines of access lists. This could be a full version or a patch, and being able to populate and distribute that configuration to multiple devices. So the major risk around doing manual upgrades or config changes is human error, and it's time consuming, right? So this means that if you have to push two lines of access lists to all your devices, or if you have to add a new engineer join the team and you want to add a user for that engineer on all your switches or all your firewalls, this is a very tedious manual process that's going to take you a lot of time and is prone to human error. So I'm going to talk about a couple of use cases around what we can do with the orchestration. But if up until now I've been talking about pulling information from the devices, so the config backups, the routing information, the asset information, with our orchestration capability, we are able to push configurations back to devices. So let's take a couple of use cases. The first one doesn't really apply to this show specifically because Palo is doing a really good job as far as application recognition. But this is a great use case for other types of devices. So one of the challenges that we found is how a lot of customers are using Office 365 applications. So how do we now control access to those cloud applications? So what we're doing with the Office 365 is we're basically dynamically pulling the Microsoft IP, IPv4, IPv6, URL, FQDN information from Microsoft, and then giving you the ability to automatically populate your firewall management systems with all these different types of objects and networks. That means that if you need to, for example, give somebody access to Skype, one of the challenges that you'll find is that Microsoft keeps changing those IP addresses. So the only way you're going to know that that IP change or multiple IPs change is when somebody's going to complain that their Skype, for example, is not working. And what you're going to have to do is probably go to the firewall logs, see the drop entities, create that host, and populate it within your management. So with Backbox, we're automating that. So we're pulling that information dynamically, creating those different types of hosts and networks, the IPv4, v6, et cetera, and giving you the ability with a single click to create that access rule for the application. So now you're ahead of the problem. So you are able to, for example, create the access rules you need for Skype and then eliminate that problem before the user actually talks about it. Another use case I want to talk about is, for example, let's say that we want to configure AAA radius configuration on all our switches. So we have 1,000 switches. We want to move from username and passwords on the switch itself. We now want to give people access through radius authentication. So this is going to present a couple of challenges. One, it's going to take you a long time, even if you script it. Second problem is going to be, how do we verify that that configuration that we push to the device is actually working? So not only do you have to deploy that config change, but you have to test it one by one on every switch because you don't want to be locked out of those switches. So with Backbox, what we're doing is we're giving you the ability to push that configuration. With Cisco, it's about 3 lines of configs. But not only are we pushing the configuration to those devices, but while we're connected and before we're writing the configuration and saving it, we're going to initiate a second connection to that same switch, as an example, or to that firewall, and we will validate that the radius authentication is actually working. Once we know it's working, then we'll commit the changes, save the changes, and we'll log out of the box and move on to the next one. So it's something that could have taken you hours, if not days, you can automate with Backbox with a single click. Let's talk about upgrades. So you guys mentioned some of you are in 7. Most of you are in version 8, probably 8.1 or a little bit more. And now you want to move to 9.x. So upgrading a single firewall is easy. Just upload the file, the system will reboot. It doesn't take long. But if you have a larger infrastructure and you have dozens of firewalls and they're clustered, some of them, then this is something that's probably going to take months, right? You need maintenance windows for each one. You need an engineer on hand. It's probably going to take about 30 to 60 minutes to upgrade each endpoint. But with Backbox, not only are we able to push patches, upgrades, minor and major versions, But we're doing all of that and verifying each step of that process. So let me explain how we do this. So when we have a task that we want to upgrade, this is an example for a clustered firewall. So the first thing that we do is we look at certain parameters that exist within that firewall. So we're going to look at the number of interfaces, VLANs, the routing information, and we'll look at the session table, understand how many sessions roughly exist within that gateway. Once we have all this information, we will start the upgrade process. So we will check which device, which endpoint is active and which one is passive. We'll start with the passive one. We'll deploy that major or minor version. And then at the end of that, usually the system will reboot. Once it comes up, we will revalidate all the parameters that we checked before. So we'll make sure that we have the same number of interfaces, we didn't lose any of them, same number of routes, and roughly the same size of a session table. Once we're done with that passive, we'll fail over the cluster, make sure that that's functioning, and then we'll do the same thing on the second gateway. So that means it's something that could have taken you months because you had to do it with multiple maintenance windows. Now you can do maybe over a single or two weekends. So we can upgrade 100 firewalls within minutes, right? Because we're doing this in parallel. And one of the cool things that we can do is set dependencies. So don't upgrade cluster A if cluster B was not successful. So you can set your own dependencies and make sure that if anything happens during that process, we can stop that task and we can automatically roll back. So if we find during those validations that I mentioned, if anything is not in sync with what we were expecting, Backbox can automatically roll back the version, and because we have the configs backed up already, we'll also be able to recover that device to the same state that it was if any of those validations fail. Let's talk a little bit about monitoring. So I'm sure that everybody here in this room has a monitoring solution, right? You're monitoring all your gateways and all your switches, and you're making sure that they're up. Usually this is done through ping, service ports, maybe SNMP. So what we wanted to do with our monitoring is take you a little bit deeper into the application. So we wanted to make sure that not only is your device up, but we want to make sure that it's functioning the way you're expecting it to function. So things like the session table, as I mentioned before, the NAT table, anything around certificate expirations, VPN tunnels. So we're looking at those devices, your security networking devices, not only if they're up, but are the parameters that are on those devices in line with what we're expecting. So that means that if we have a gateway, for example, that usually on average will have, 200 megs of throughput, and something happens, so this could be a DDoS attack, this could be just abnormal traffic on the network, we will look at the throughput, and anything that exceeds what we're expecting, we will alert on. So we have approximately 1,200 different signatures, we call them, that will help you understand whether your devices are functioning properly. So that's as far as performance is concerned. The second thing that we do with our IntelliChecks is we run compliance checks. So this is not the standard compliance that you're familiar with Palo or other configuration management system where they're looking at your policy. We're not looking at the policy at all. Rather, we're looking at the platform itself. So we're making sure that your devices are configured and are complying with your own corporate standard. Things like, do we have an NTP server configured? Do we have the right DNS server configured? We recently I spoke to somebody from Fuel yesterday. Fuel came out with a best practices document. It's about a 300-page document that tells you basically how your devices, how your PA gateways and panoramas should be configured. And we took, I think, about 80 different recommendations from that document, which cover about 80% of what they have to offer, and we added those signatures to Backbox. That means that with a single click, we can go through all your PA devices and give you a gap analysis report on whether your devices are configured based on those best practices. Now, the cool thing is that you can customize and configure these checks to meet your criteria. That means that obviously, not only are we going to check if if we have a DNS or NTP server configured, or whether somebody by mistake enabled, for example, Telnet or HTTP on my gateway rather than SSH and HTTPS. But you can configure those different parameters and what you expect them to be. So if you have to comply with your own corporate standards, you can take all these different checks and customize them and run these compliance tests as often as you want. So not only can you use the built-in checks that we have, but you can create your own. So as far as performance and the compliance, you can create your own signatures. We do not use any type of scripting language whatsoever, so you don't have to know any coding or any scripting. We basically mimic what you would be doing manually if you had to check something. So if you log on to a PA device and execute a command in order to get, for example, your DNS configuration, and you know what that command is, you can then put it in Backbox and run your own custom checks. The third thing that we do is we give you performance information over time. And this is important specifically for capacity optimization and capacity planning. So if you have devices which are 3-4 years old and you're planning on upgrading them to new appliances, you would need to know, usually the question is going to be from any Palo Alto account manager, is what kind of device do you want? What do you want, a 50, 60? What's the throughput? What's your VPN throughput? Are you utilizing all the different security capabilities? And that's one of the biggest challenges. What type of box do I need to go to? So with our capacity planning, we're showing you all the different parameters that we checked before with our performance capabilities and giving you that information over time. So you can see your connection table or your session table growth. You can see your throughput growth. You can see the number of connected VPN users, and are we growing? And then you can better plan the type of box that you need to move to. So in this use case, we will log in depending on the type of check. Since, again, we already have the credential information. And most of this is done, by the way, not via SNMP. So most of the vendors do not offer a lot of checks that you can run via SNMP. So we're actually logging in usually through SSH, and we're executing commands, application-specific commands. So we will log on to each of those devices based on whatever interval you want to check, depending on the check. So if you want to check, for example, your certificate expirations, that's probably not a check you want to run every hour. This could run every day or every week, and we will alert if a certificate is about to expire. But things like throughput, you might want to check more often. So we will log on using those same credentials that we already have. By the way, as far as credentials are concerned, we will log in using either a static username password that you can configure within our application. We can also utilize Radius, TACAX, LDAP, and if you're using CyberArk for strong authentication, we have support for that as well. So we will log on to each device, execute those commands, either the ones that we have built in or the ones that you customize for yourself. Look for certain parameters, match it against what you're expecting, and then based on the severity, we will choose the type of notifications. So this could be just an email report of all the checks that we're running for compliance, for example, or if this is more real-time type of check, so we can set a syslog message or an SNMP trap as well. So let's take another example. So we want to now run those compliance checks on, so I mentioned here a switch, a layer 2 or a layer 3 switch, but this could be any of your Palo Alto gateways as well. So we will log in to each and every device, and in this example, you'll see that we'll check for the SNMP version, whether v3 is configured or not. We'll check for the certificate expiration and whether somebody enabled Telnet on that device. So we will log into each and every device, look for those parameters, and then send you a report with your compliance scoring. Again, very important. We do have a lot of checks built in, but you can create your own. BAM. Where's Stephanie? That's number 2. So today we're introducing something new. It's called, well, BAM, number 3, Backbox Application Availability Monitoring. So this is a challenge that we heard from customers over the past few months, where I talked about checking the availability of our gateways and monitoring them and making sure that they're functioning properly. let's take this a little bit outside the scope of our security network devices, and let's talk about availability of our corporate applications. This could be internal applications or cloud-based applications. The challenge there is, how do I check that either an internal application, this could be a SAP, this could be any type of CRM, this could be Office 365 in the cloud, Salesforce, ServiceNow, whatever it is, I'll probably monitor using our existing monitoring tools that service is available. But I'll probably ping it, maybe even run a HTTP command to make sure that it's actually returning something. But I'll check it from my NOC, right? So I have a data center, I have my application, my monitoring application in my NOC, and I'll check that it's actually functioning. But what if I want to check, I have a distributed environment, I have locations globally, and now I want to make sure that Salesforce or any other corporate application, internal or external, is not just available from my NOC, but it's available from every single location in my network. So the challenge there is, basically what we heard is that people are logging on to, for example, a remote desktop in China, and now they're checking from that remote desktop that our corporate application is available. And then they're logging on to their Amsterdam data center and checking that the application is available from there. So that's one challenge. The second challenge, and this is for us specifically engineers, is every time we upgrade a device or we introduce a new device, what you'll probably do at the end of that upgrade process is you'll call somebody or multiple people and say, okay, check if everything's working. Right? And I don't know how many of you encountered this. I saw this many times where you finish an upgrade and then somebody says, well, this application is not working. And then you start trying to debug and troubleshoot. And if you don't figure it out, you roll back. And then you roll back and then you say, well, it's still not working. So it wasn't the upgrade's fault. So our application availability monitoring basically gives us the ability, to create your own set of tests that Backbox will execute, in this instance, before an upgrade. So this is not, again, we're not testing the security and network infrastructure. We're making sure that our applications are available through our firewalls. So you will create your own list of checks. That means, okay, so let's take a host in Amsterdam. That's going to be our source. Our destination is going to be our CRM application in the data center, and we're going to test HTTPS to make sure that we're getting pages back. So you create your own set of checks that we can execute before the upgrade, and we'll save that information. Once the upgrade is complete, we'll run those checks again and give you a side-by-side comparison. So something that usually takes probably an hour or two to make sure that after an upgrade everything is functioning is now with a single click. So now you know if something is not working, was it the upgrade that caused that application to stop functioning? Now, the second use case is checking the availability of our applications from different locations. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we already are connecting to all your devices, right? So we're connected to all your switches and all your firewalls. So now our ability to check that your corporate applications, whether inside your data center or in the cloud, are available from different locations, since we're already connected to all our endpoints. So this could be layer 2, layer 3 switches, this could be our firewalls. Now we can test your application availability from those different locations. So we will log into a firewall in Amsterdam, and from that endpoint, we will initiate a connection to your corporate application and make sure that it's available. So something that we heard from customers that they're running daily tests. So somebody's walking in the morning and making sure, logging into multiple locations to make sure that everything is up and available from those different locations. With Backbox, since we're already connected and we have the credential information for all your devices, we can test that for you. So the added value here, as opposed to your standard monitoring solution, is we will tell you that everything is available from all locations that you have on the network. So this is still beta. So those of you that are Backbox customers, so this will be available in about a month, but we'll be able to show you this in our booth. So before we get to the questions, I mentioned this, and Lee's still back there, so I'm just going to say 170 plus vendors. Probably every name that you can think of, which I'm not going to name, that you have on the network, we have support for. all the ones that we saw. Now, obviously, there are more than 170 security networking vendors out there. And the important piece here is that I mentioned before, the customization capability. Everything that we do, so this could be the backups, the recoveries, the IntelliChecks that I mentioned, the performance and the capacity, and even those tests, they, again, do not require any type of scripting language, any type of coding. So if you have a device or a product from a vendor that is not included within those 170 vendors, using our free of charge professional services, part of our SLA, we can add support for a new device usually within 24 hours. This never goes back to R&D. This is all in the front end of the web interface that we have. So as long as you know, or we can help you figure it out, as long as you know what commands you need to execute on a particular device, either for a backup or a check or a monitoring signature, as long as you know what that command is, we can add support for it right there on the spot. And you can create your own. So if you have a device, and we saw this mainly with the military, where we cannot gain access to their, I would call it secret devices. So they have the ability to create their own scripts that will run those different processes that I mentioned as far as backup, recovery, upgrades, and configuration manipulation. So I think we're just over 1,200 different products and versions that we have built-in support for out of the 170 vendors. But again, you can customize and add your own. Two more things I want to mention before we get to the Q&A is multi-tenancy. Those of you that are service providers or organizations where you have different teams managing different types of devices, Backbox is multi-tenant. So with a single instance of Backbox, you can have separation of duty. You can create multiple types of groups and users, and each one will be able to manage their own devices. Add to that, our granular role-based administration will give you the ability to control what your admins can do on each device. So some might only be able to back up a device, some might be able to execute tasks, and some maybe just be able to monitor the system and make sure that everything's functioning properly. The second thing I wanted to mention is the distributed architecture that we have. So Backbox is comprised of two main components, the management platform and the agents that are executing. Don't confuse this with agents on the endpoints. As I mentioned before, we're absolutely agentless on the devices themselves. But if you have a large environment and you scatter across multiple data centers, you can install additional Backbox VMs in those locations that will give you both high availability and load balancing for backing up the configurations of the devices. I mentioned before the notifications and the credential sets that we support. So again, static username passwords, Radius, LDAP, and CyberArk. We also have built-in support for two-factor authentication within Backbox. So to summarize, Backbox is meant to make your life a little bit easier and make sure that everything that you are supposed to execute on your devices, you can do it more quickly, more efficiently, and eliminate risk mainly because we're automating and we're not running manual processes.